Hi, everyone. This is acyuta-bhava from Nightlight Astrology, and today I'm hanging out with my friend Kat from the Creative Introvert. You all know Kat by now. Kat comes on every once in a while and helps me with some Q&A episodes. She is my social media manager, and she aggregates all the questions that you guys have in the chat boxes or that come in through emails. And occasionally we get together, and she helps me field Q&A. All the questions that you have and acts kind of as an interviewer. So really glad to have you here today, Kat. And yeah, what are we talking about?
Yeah, thank you. It's always good to be here. We're going to be talking about the problem of coming out of the astrology closet. So how do we explain to friends and family that we are into astrology? Because, not everyone's up for that. And some people have conflicting beliefs.
Yeah, that's a tough one. And it's really important. Here's my number one piece of advice. And I have I guess there's several layers of advice that I would give because there's different angles to the question and the experience of sort of coming out of the astrological closet and telling people this, I really love this, I'm really interested in it, I believe in it, whatever. But the first one is play the long game. And that, I think that's just true in life in general. And what I mean by that is you don't just because you're falling in, most people, when they get into astrology, they sort of fall in love with it, they get bit by the bug, and they're very passionate about it, very enthusiastic, and you're really seeing it working, and your mind is being opened, your heart is being opened. You're tapping into a spiritual science that's thousands of years old, and it is pretty exciting. It makes you feel like the cosmos and your life is actually as meaningful as your heart and soul want to believe that it is. So it's this confirmation of sorts. And the natural desire of the heart is to share your joy with other people. So it's all very natural to want to share with people. And you have to remember that it's kind of like what Plato said about the prisoners in the cave. Not to say that I'm not trying to demean or degrade anyone, but just kind of a good analogy. Um, the philosopher, the one who crawls out of the cave and says, "Whoa, the Matrix is real," like, like that, and then they go back into the cave, and the prisoners are the prison. That was like my worst Keanu Reeves impression ever. They go back into the cave, and the prisoners in the cave are like not ready for that. They're not here for that, as the kids are saying these days. So it's like we have to recognize that people most of the time, the people that are not interested in astrology are going to fall into one of two categories. They're going to be really hardcore, sort of empirical, I would just call kind of like secular material empiricists, or they're going to be really deeply religious in one way or another. And either way, they're going to reject astrology without knowing much about it. And maybe there's other categories of people. I'm just sort of giving you my categories from what I've experienced. And those categories of people are not going to be convinced right away. So I don't recommend is trying to go and, a missionary evangelical battering ram of astrology into their lives is not going to change them if they've developed a point of view against astrology that hasn't really come from getting to know it themselves or having an open-minded approach to it. So play the long game, which is to say, let people just notice over a long period of time that you really love something. The tricky part is if you're in a relationship with someone who feels very negatively about it, like you're married to someone, like that's probably the toughest scenario that I encounter with people. But otherwise, it's sort of my number one piece of advice is just don't have an agenda about anything. Let your interests sort of naturally come out, and let people see over time that you're not here to talk about it or convince them about it. You're happy, you're doing well, you're safe, you're reasonable. And it kind of speaks for itself over time.
Yeah. Yeah, I'm glad you brought up the point of not trying to maybe convince people of your love for astrology and why they should maybe love it too. Though I do think that is really tempting because if somebody, I think the way a lot of people who are into astrology perceive the others, it's that, you just don't know astrology. If you knew it like I knew it, you would get it and you would love it too. So I guess obviously we don't want to shove anything down the throat of somebody who isn't interested in it at all. But there might be people in our lives who are getting curious. And I'm just wondering if you have any experiences with that that line between people who are definitely not interested in learning more and people who are sort of who you might be able to, share a little bit more about it and maybe at least help them understand why you're into it. Does that make
Yeah,
sense?
that's good. And so that there's let's say you have let's take the people who aren't interested and let's put them into two categories. Let's say passively not interested and aggressively not interested. So
Vehemently anti.
right. So with those kind of people, the people who are passively not interested, I say take your time. Just play the long game. And not that you're trying to get, I mean, by play the long game, I just mean assume that in time those people may naturally come to at the very least accept that this is what you're into and not find it a source of contention because you've never made it that. On the other hand, with people who are, like family members who like aggressively come after you, my simple advice is to take this stance, not to get into it, because you most of the time you're not going to use reason to convince somebody out of a position that they didn't really use reason to get into in the first place. And I'm not saying that there aren't reasonable critiques of astrology or reasonable, concerns or skepticism. I'm saying when someone has already decided they're closed to something, they've never studied it, they don't really know about what the faith of astrologers looks like or how an astrologer comes, like what is their epistemology, how have they come to know what they know. They don't know any of that. They're just vehemently going after you. I wouldn't engage with such a person. I would just say, hey, look, I see that you really don't like astrology, that you really think it's bogus. And I get that. And I respect that that's your point of view. And I just ask that you respect that that's not where I'm coming from. I really love it. And, I don't feel like I want to engage in a big battle about this with you because I just feel like that would damage our relationship. I've found that 9 times out of 10, when I've said that to people, that the few times that I've had that happen, mostly people who are like close to me or maybe someone on the internet or something like that, that usually it diffuses very quickly. And then again, like what has spoken more loudly, love and compassion and patience. And if that's the byproduct of you studying astrology, a person's going to think about that a little bit. And again, I think that's a better way in over a long period of time. Okay, so that's that category. Go over to the other category where you were mentioning where people who are kind of interested in astrology, they might want to know more. And if I understood your question correctly, Kat, it's sort of like how might you speak to people who are somewhat open? Is that right?
Yeah, and maybe even what are some, maybe this will be obvious to people, but even like telltale signs of their own interest or them softening enough for you to kind of go in there with,
Yeah.
yeah.
Okay, so I'll break that into two categories as well. So you have passively interested and actively interested. And the passively interested people, let me give you an example of passively interested. Passively interested can come off sometimes like aggressively disinterested. That's why it's such a funny category. Passively disinterested is a family member who, I'm thinking in particular of different encounters I've had with extended family on both my wife's side and my side and stuff like that. And you'll get teased or prodded or poked a little bit about astrology in one way or another, like, oh God, well, I don't ever want you to look at my chart because you'd see what a total mess my life is, or something like that. They'd be like, oh, that's probably because I'm like an Aquarius or something. Blah, 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 blah. It's like,
Mm-mm-mm.
and there's in that actually is there often like this the seeds of someone who's actually interested. And in a number of cases like that, again, for me, it's like when someone's passively interested, they're not giving you an actual opening, but they're trying to relate with you somehow about astrology. I found that in those cases, playing the long game is still the best answer. You go like, I'm thinking of like an uncle of mine that actually ended up getting a reading from me one time, and there was a few like, not like unkind, but just like kind of poking, whatever. And I just said I would just joke along and kind of meet him at his level, just be like, yeah, that is really funny. That is kind of like how Aquarians can be. Have you ever had your chart read before? No. Oh yeah, yeah. It can be really cool. It's cool to look at, and just kind of leave it there, like almost like you're acknowledge where someone's coming from, but they're passively interested. Don't in some ways it's like they're waiting for you to be evangelical so that they can say no. So the passive interest, again, I find that it's just like like celebrate that there's some camaraderie, and don't be offended if you need to get light compared to what you usually are. Like usually I'm like, well, I study Hellenistic astrology, like it's very spiritual. I don't talk about sun signs or something like that, and then the other person immediately feels alien. They're like, well, dude, I thought I was like, most people think astrology is crazy. I was just trying to relate with you. So you have to like take any interest that comes your way. You can't, you have to be very humble and just be like, okay, someone's trying to meet me where I'm at, and I'm gonna take that, and then don't try to make anything of it. Try to establish the relationship first, that a person feels comfortable talking to you about astrology. I find that again, then in time, gradually, they're gonna say, so like, here's the uncle next time we're sitting around the bonfire out at the lake here in Minnesota, and it's like, so what can you see with that kind of stuff? And that's like 2 years later. You know what I mean? Like, and then like, well, you can see a lot of different things. And so then the conversation evolves, and eventually you're reading that person's chart maybe. And it's not that that's the goal either. It's just, that's how it can evolve. Then you have people who are actively interested, and the actively interested people, um, you have to be careful, because actively interested people could also be testing astrology. It doesn't mean that they are ready to just sign up for a course. Uh, it they're still almost have to treat it like someone's actively interested, that 90% of what you say could push them away. And so, it's still just kind of thinking, look, this person might be showing me their interest, but it's like, if you were to go into a store and you say to someone like, I'm shopping for a mattress, and there's always like, I just had this experience last year because we had to get a new mattress. There's always someone in the store whose job it is to get the commission or whatever for selling you the mattress. So they're kind of, watch you, they're hovering around you. And on that rare instance where you're like, I really do need a mattress, so I will ask the salesperson to like help me. Then the salesperson starts just laying it on, and you're like, oh shit, don't want this right now. I want someone who can help me make a decision, not who can close a sale. And I think that we have to be really good representatives of astrology in that case. And if someone's interested, give them resources that are going to be really good for, at least this is my opinion, give them resources that are going to be really good for people who are very new to astrology. Maybe say, let me send you some resources. Here's a good podcast you might like. Here's an astrologer that I think is pretty down to earth. Here's some specific videos from this YouTube that, it kind of explains what astrology is about, or here's a good book you could read. If you want, I could read your chart for you sometime. It could be really like casual. I could just kind of show you what astrology is like. I find that when people have that sense of like, I don't have to enter into something formal, I'm just being given some get to know you material from a trusted person whose agenda is not to get me to do or believe something, that's going to be effective. So that's kind of my array. I'd never had these. I made these categories up on the spot today, but they sound pretty good, don't they?
They were very good, very helpful, very ordered. Liked it. Yeah, and I like that you mentioned kind of not getting. I'm not sure these were your words, but with the uncle, like not almost getting offended when they're trying to meet you, like they're trying to share something with you, they're trying to relate to you. I've had that with some, like, I would say they would be in the passively interested skeptics in my life who are kind of like joshing me about it, but who are also, I can tell, kind of curious. Mm-hmm. And because I've been like open to their disagreements and their kind of critiques of astrology, and not been sort of like, gone away in a huff, they've been encouraged, and I've been able to have proper conversations with them. So I think, not being offended is kind of key here as well.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, not being offended is definitely important. There's a great verse in the book of Philippians, I think it was, in the New Testament, where it says, do all things without complaining or arguing. And I find that if an astrologer has this chip on their shoulder about people not liking or respecting astrology, then you don't know it. But when someone comes to you about astrology, you're answering from the place of inborn complaints and argumentation. Whereas if you feel really comfortable with astrology, you don't need to prove it to anyone. You don't, need anyone else to offer you validation about it. You're not trying to get it approved at Harvard, let's get the Harvard people to really believe in it, or whatever the ivory tower, elites, whoever they are. If you don't have that attitude, then it's really hard to get involved with conversations with people where, complaining or argumentation is going to be the baseline of the situation.
Yeah. Cool. Well, I think that's all I've got on the questions about this.
I think there's two things we might add really quickly that come to my mind that I just thought people might like this, Kat. One is that you're also going to have two general ways that people sometimes attack astrology that I think people could be aware of. Do you want me to go into those real briefly?
Yeah, definitely.
Okay, so one is going to be the scientific approach. And the scientific approach is like, I'm just saying this sort of broadly. People are saying astrology is a pseudoscience. Astrology is basically there's no proof. There's no.
Yeah, it's all cognitive biases.
Yes, that's right. That's right. So here's what I say to that, and if it's helpful for other people. I always tell people astrology isn't a science, not in the way that at least sort of modern empirical, science is defined. It has elements that are reasonable, very reasonable, logical, schematic, consistent underlying rationale and first principles rooted in astronomy, math, geometry. But they're being used in service of something that I don't think can be called science by what the modern definition of science is. And that is that it's divination, which means that this symbolic language, which is rooted in first principles, like, again, logic and rationality, but all of these are in service to this other thing that is a connection between a diviner and spirit. Spirit could be the voice of the gods. It could be God. It could be angels. But throughout the history of it could be the daimon, as you very well know, because your Kat's going to be teaching a class on the daimon coming up. We'll talk about that before we end. But that's not the same as a hard science. We're not saying, in other words, that astrology, that the planets are causing everything to happen. Are there energies in the cosmos that the planets may symbolically point to? Yes, but I don't think personally, the ancient astrologers, didn't believe this, that the planets were literally causing everything to happen. That development happened much later in the history of astrology, where people started thinking of everything like a causal science. But in fact, the earliest way of thinking about the symbolic language is that it is a kind of symbolic mirror that reflects something of the patterned unfoldings of mind and body of the cosmos, and that it can be used as this kind of divinatory mirror, just like tarot. So in other words, I always refer to tarot because it's like, if people attack you scientifically, say, well, astrology is more like tarot or the I Ching than it is like a hard modern empirical science, and that it immediately shuts down the conversation in some ways. So that's not always a good thing. But you do have to say it's a faith-based practice, because you really essentially have to believe that these symbols can be omens or signs that speak something about the will of the gods or the laws, the intangible, mysterious laws of the cosmos. And when I tell people that, what I find is that I'm not baited into a conversation that I can't possibly win, because astrologers have always lost that conversation historically. In fact, some of the times that astrology has gone into sort of dark ages where it's lost a lot of momentum has been due to basically trying to, empiricize astrology, and it hasn't worked. And then it's become like a laughing stock. And I believe that would be the wrong approach to do for tarot or the I Ching too. It's divination is something different until empirical science becomes, and I think some science is interested in consciousness, right? in non-ordinary states of consciousness and other worlds, higher dimensions, other beings. Like I don't think that science has to be closed to anybody. I don't think science is an enemy. But you know, until science is actively interested in asking the question, how does divination work? You know, acknowledging that it does and then saying, how is it that it does? The conversation is really going to be difficult. So I tell people, just don't get baited into it. Just tell people, I'm not claiming that it's a science. I believe that it's a form of divination. Some people will say it's a combination of mythology, therapy, psychology, and art. I don't personally agree with that. I think that sort of, to me personally, although I think there's elements of that are true, I think astrology, properly speaking, is divination. But whatever, that's a debate for another day. The second thing I wanted to say, Kat, was that the other thing that we need to be careful of is that we don't appear anti-scientific, you know, because it can be frustrating to deal with criticisms from people who want to say you're unreasonable, you're irrational, da da da. And so we want to fight back and say, no, scientists are the real idiots. They're just objectifying everything at the Church of Science, stripping everything of spirit, da da da. It's like, don't be tempted into going on the attack. There's a reason that, you know, there's a huge like anti-science, like science denialism within New Age spiritual communities right now, because science has been, in some ways, you get these attacks if you're a yoga practitioner, if you meditate, if you're a religious person, if you like divination, blah, blah, blah. You get attacked if you like crystals under the moonlight and you're, you know, and charge them under your pillow, or you know what I mean? Like you get attacked by people saying, oh, you're hokey, you're irrational. So then after a while you start thinking, no, they're the enemy. But then the problem with that is that you can start denying things like climate change, or you can, you know what I mean? You can start not listening to the voice of reason when you should. So I don't think science is our enemy or anything, but I do think we have to be really careful with how we navigate that part of criticism and attack, and just being like, hey, look, it's not a big deal to say I have a faith-based practice. It's divination. That's how I handle it these days, anyway.
Yeah, no, thank you for bringing those points up. You reminded me that one of the upsides to having people in your life who don't get astrology is that it can push you to not necessarily like test your own beliefs, but really deepen them and figure out, all right, well, what is it about astrology that I really love? How do I understand astrology? Having that skeptic friend has really forced me to ask those questions. So there are some upsides to this. And I did just want to remind people that there is a playlist that you've got, which has got a lot of beginners material. So that's always a good one that I've sent people to before as well.
You and Kat organized that. So thank you for that. Yeah, there's a book that I recommend for anyone who's interested in the epistemology of astrology, which means how do astrologers know what they know and how do they come to the knowledge claims that they have. Probably the best book written in, I'd say, the past 100 years, maybe the only one written in the past 100 years about the epistemology of astrology. And it's called The Moment of Astrology by Jeffrey Cornelius. The subtitle is Origins and Divination. This book was really the answer I was looking for in terms of how do we come to understand, you know, what astrology is and how it claims to know what it knows. And it's a deep philosophical book. It's not like it's accessible, but it will take a little bit, like it requires a little bit of blood, sweat, and tears to read it, but it's very good. And so I highly recommend people check that out. But okay, well, I guess that's what we've got for today. Thank you, Kat, for coming on. Kat's doing a workshop for my spring speaker series coming up on the daimon. Do you want to say a word about that really quick?
Yeah, it's just a kind of brief overview of the personal daimon, looking at astrology, a couple of different techniques. And yeah, just a fun romp with the daimon. Yeah, look forward to it.
That sounds fun. Yeah, it's going to be awesome. So you can find that on my website, nightlightastrology.com. Go to the events page. You can sign up for free. Kat will be giving that talk. She's done other talks on the daimon too. You can find her work at thecreativeintrovert.com. Do I have that right, Kat? Yep. And on Instagram too. So, all right. Well, that's what we've got for today. Thanks so much, Kat, for being here. And we'll talk to you all again soon.